Welcome in to Vol Basketball Fever, your number one source for discussions about the Vols and Lady Vols basketball programs. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a video, and check in every week for new episodes of the show, video breakdowns, and more. Now, on with the episode. Hello everyone, and welcome in to another episode of the Vol Basketball Fever podcast. I am Nathanael Rutherford, joined by Gene Henley here for another episode of the show. Thank you all so much for tuning in. It's been a while since we've had an actual episode of the show. Lately, it's been me having a couple interviews here and there, but Gene, it's been a couple weeks since you and I have sat down to do a podcast together. I'm very excited to do it with you because we have a lot to talk about since we last spoke. Last thing we talked about was Julian Phillips and Tobe Awaka and Tennessee looking for a point guard transfer. Well, since then, Tennessee's main point guard target has announced his decision, is not coming to Tennessee. Tennessee added another 2022 prospect and also got a commitment from a 23 kid. So we'll talk about all of that, along with a couple of guys returning from the NBA draft, I guess, consideration that are coming back for Tennessee this year. Grant Williams in the NBA Finals. We have a lot to cover. May not get to all of that, but we'll get to most of it here in just a minute. But again, I want to say thank you all to all of you who are watching or listening at home or at the gym or at work or wherever you may be, driving somewhere. Thank you so much. If you're listening to the podcast, if you're watching the video here on YouTube, again, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Give this video a like if you're on YouTube, and share it and subscribe if you haven't to the channel already. We'll hopefully have a couple more interviews and stuff coming up with coaches and players in the near future. But for now, Gene, let's get into an episode here of the podcast. Again, it's been a couple weeks, a lot to talk about. The biggest one is the commitment and I guess signing actually within basically an hour of his commitment announcement of four-star DJ Jefferson. He was at Minnesota Prep Academy. He kind of came on strong. I was able to go talk to his head coach at Minnesota Prep, so I'll put a card in the top right-hand corner here on YouTube if you're watching, to go listen to that interview with his head coach at Minnesota Prep, Lucas Patterson, that talked about kind of his ceiling. He thinks he has a very high ceiling. I think looking at his film, Gene, he really intrigues me as a wing. Does DJ Jefferson? He's a guy who has really exceptional leaping ability. He's a guy that, according to his head coach, was actually, before he came to Minnesota Prep, I want to say he was originally from Texas, and they had him playing as an undersized four because of his athleticism. That's kind of a 6'5" guy playing as an undersized four at that school. Came to Minnesota Prep and played more on the wing, and they taught him some more, things about playing on the wing, specifically on defense, because his offense, he, was already pretty versatile there, but playing on defense. And I think Jefferson's going to be interesting. I don't know that he's a guy that I am foreseeing coming in and making a, massive impact in year one, but I think he's a guy who is just really kind of starting to scratch the surface of his potential, and I think he has a lot of potential. He's a guy that I hope sticks around for Tennessee and doesn't, if he doesn't get a lot of playing time this year, decides to transfer, because I think he's a guy that, again, has a lot of potential. And I think we talked about it last time we did a podcast, Gene, where if it's basically going to come down to him and Jabari Meshack kind of for that position, because they both play similar positions and are both built pretty similarly. And it's going to come down to, does Jabari make that leap on offense this year and is able to kind of, I guess, maybe catapult himself into the following season as their role, or does DJ Jefferson come in and already kind of outwork him, outpace him on offense, and eventually can maybe outpace him defensively? I think that'll be interesting to watch. Maybe not as much this year, maybe next year, but Gene, DJ Jefferson to me is a guy that was a late spring, really started coming on, a fast riser, really blew up at the Iverson Classic, got a 4-star ranking on, I think, most services. I know On3 gave him a 4-star ranking. I want to say 247 also did when they updated their stuff as well. But he's a kid that, Gene, I think could potentially be a steal for Tennessee, again, assuming that he is, stays happy with the situation. If he doesn't play much this year and doesn't transfer out, I think he's a kid that, personality wise and everything from what his coach said, seems to be also the type of guy that Mark Barnes and the staff also really like. But I like the pickup, and Gene, that leaves Tennessee one more spot, which we'll get to in a second. But this has been from going for BJ Edwards as the only signee in the 22 class for the longest time. Now suddenly you end up adding Julian Phillips, DJ Jefferson, and more than likely Tobe Awaka to the group. Also, bringing in Tyreek Key as a transfer. It goes from a kind of I won't say disappointment, but like a not super heralded 22 class. All of a sudden now, there's some pretty strong pieces you're bringing in this 22 class.
Right. And I'm sorry for anybody that may have heard me make a sound in the midst of this, but I just noticed that Malachi Smith just committed to Gonzaga in the middle of him saying that. So sorry to anybody that's heard me say "hoo-hoo" in the middle of that. But yeah, I mean, like you look at the pieces they've added, and I don't know much. I mean, like you look at what Julian Phillips and DJ. I'm literally typing all these names in right now as we speak. Like you look at what these pieces have. Real quick, Nathanael, like they are at 11 scholarships, or am I missing somebody here?
Yeah, assuming Awaka is in the 22
Okay,
class.
that's the kid.
If you put
Yeah,
him in
that's the
22,
kid
then
I
they're at 12.
Gotcha. So I just wanted to I like to have a working list with in the off season, so I know when we get to the inevitable point in the summer where we start saying, what could this team be? I want to make sure I have the whole roster in front of me. Yeah, gotta love the additions. Gotta love what they're trying to do. Like you look, and like this is what 2-3 consecutive years where the recruiting class that you see in November is not the recruiting class that you ultimately have. And I think that's good, because that's where we are right now, where you don't really worry too much about recruiting during the season, because I mean, you know how you recruit now. You just watch college basketball. You watch mid-major basketball. You fall down the rabbit hole of saying, of watching some random Indiana State game, saying, "Man, that guy's from Tennessee, right? He's a good player. He could end up helping." And then you look, that's because that's essentially what Tennessee's done with their recruiting. They're like, okay, you look for distressed assets. Tyreek Key, kid who, obviously probably would have loved. I don't know. I don't read all the stories, but probably grew up knowing at least enough about Tennessee to say I wouldn't mind going there if they offered. It took 4 extra years and a lot of points scored in Indiana, but he's there now. Distress asset, Julian Phillips, kid who obviously was recruited by the staff, but was not going to come here. You get him on the back end, distress asset because of a fired coach, and here we are. And then DJ Jefferson, another kid who I think is going to kind of have maybe a Zeigler-like impact, because these kids who kind of come on late. I feel like I could be way off on this, but the kids who come on late ultimately have the potential to end up being pretty good. It may take a year, because look at Olivier Kamwa. That was a kid they got late 3 years ago. I guess he's the only one that's currently on the roster that would apply to, because Tamba, who just committed to Weber State, that was a kid who reclassified. Brandon Henley Hatfield reclassified.
I think you may have said Arbet Ziegler. I mean, he came on late, more or less, too.
Yeah, and then I hadn't mentioned him yet, but yeah, that's what I was leading at. It's like you look, and that's a kid who came on, and like it's there's a hunger that exists with those kids, because maybe they've always felt overlooked. Here comes their opportunity, and here comes that one big tournament. Here come all the big schools. You come in, and like the grind, like as kids say, the grind doesn't stop. It's only started. And so I like these kids who have, specifically the seniors. Like, I mean, the kids who've reclassified, we'll see about those kids. It has not worked out well so far for a lot of kids, I think, who have reclassified. I mean, not just specifically at Tennessee. I mean, Kentucky's struggled with it. Schools all across the country are struggling with these kids who reclassify. But the kids who are seniors, and it's like April of their senior year, they don't have a clue where they're going, and they blow up one big weekend during the live period. Like, those are hungry kids. So those are the kids I'll be interested to see. So like that's where Jefferson applies. So I like the addition. Like as you look at this roster, you kind of feel like a dude's going to be a good piece with what he can do. How does that work with Olivier? Where does Urosh fit in with that? So you've got a little bit of size there. You've got enough to play a couple different ways. I think the more and more, yes, you watch this roster how fluid the construction of this roster has been since 1st of April, then now all of a sudden you're looking at, okay, you start to daydream, like, what could this team be? And like, I think a lot of what they could be will be contingent on the development of their last two additions, because if they can give you something more different than what you currently have, then you could be special. Because all it takes is one or two of those kids, and I'm a big proponent of experienced guards in March, because that's who wins, and that's where Vescovy comes in. That's where Josiah comes in. So I'm loving what they're trying to do here at the very end, and I don't care if it takes till April 15th for them to figure out this roster. As long as the thing is ready and this team is like connected by November, they've got a lot of potential of being really good next year.
Well, you kind of are leading into where I was wanting to go next, looking beyond just the recent addition of Jefferson, and again kind of filling out the class. You already mentioned Santi and Josiah both coming back. We'll get to both of those guys in a second, pulling their names out of the NBA draft consideration and returning to Tennessee for their senior season, or I guess fourth years. And it's hard to, with COVID and with red shirts and stuff like that, it's hard to really call it a senior year, I guess, but their fourth season at Tennessee. But we'll get to them in a second. But you talked about having experienced backcourts and experienced guards and how that helps you win in March. And that's something that Tennessee right now, the point guard position, doesn't have. You have a Zakai Zeigler who will be a sophomore. You have a BJ Edwards who's a true freshman. We've seen Tennessee go after a couple different guys in the transfer portal at point guard, whether it was Yuri Collins, who ultimately decided to stay at St. Louis, or this most recent one, and Tyrese Hunter, who Tennessee was really battling with Texas and Kansas for, and then really seemed like it came down to Tennessee and Texas, and then ultimately he chose Texas. So Tennessee missed out on him. I've heard, there's been talks and stuff about Courtney Ramey, who was from Texas and is transferring out of Texas, was in the NBA draft consideration as well, and he took his name out and is now, I guess, kind of had been already on the open market, but it was kind of going through the process of NBA draft stuff, but now can fully, I guess, focus on the transfer portal and on the transfer process. We'll be interested to see kind of if Tennessee gets any traction. I mean, there's, I guess, traction, but, kind of if Tennessee really has a foothold there or not, or if they just kind of have a hat on the table, is not really a big, consideration or not. But Gene, there's been so much talk I've seen in message boards, I've seen on Twitter about, Tennessee pursuing a point guard, and that this is the final missing piece to take Tennessee from a preseason top 15 expectations to a top 10, maybe even top 5 expectations of getting that final point guard piece, of that experienced point guard. I think it's worth having a conversation kind of about that position for Tennessee, because I think some people maybe are just kind of, they say we need someone that's like an experienced point guard who's like a Kennedy Chandler. Well, I mean, Chandler was a freshman, I'm saying, like a guy who can better replace the production that Kennedy Chandler is leaving behind. And, I don't expect someone to come in and average 14 points a game and shoot 38% from three and average almost 5 assists per game like Chandler did last year. Hoover's left in the transfer market right now and at the point guard position. But I think a lot of people don't want to trust Zeigler as the number one option at point guard, and see him as he's undersized, but while he's been fantastic and really overperformed considering, expectations for him preseason last year, that he's maybe better as the number 2 option as a point guard and can be better as that second point guard on the floor when you have a 3-guard set out there, or I guess really a 4-guard set. When you go small ball lineup and you have Zeigler, another point guard, and Vescovy out there along with James, and then your 5. But Gene, I think you'd think people maybe would learn not to discount Zeigler after a year, but it's easy to kind of, we've talked about on the show before, it's easy to kind of get enamored with the new shiny toy and look at what can you bring in that's new, what's the new thing. I understand the concerns about handing the reins over to Zeigler, and obviously with the coaching staff pursuing all these veteran point guards, I think they themselves, maybe they don't feel comfortable with it, but I think it's worth, I wanted to talk with you about it as someone who has, years of playing experience and just your basketball mind in general. How much of a hesitancy would you have from what you saw from Zeigler this past year, and with knowing, this will be this first full actual offseason with Tennessee? He didn't join this program until August of last year, and he didn't have a full offseason last year with this program because of that, and came in late. all this different stuff. And then he, of course, was competing with a one of the top point guards in the country last year in Kennedy Chandler. And we saw, how much he improved as the year went on too. But he already was showing some flashes early in the season and in practices. Zeigler was. But Gene, as from your basketball mind, how much of a hesitancy would you have handing the reins over to Zeigler and him being just your PG1 without bringing in another guy and having him be PG1 and having BJ Edwards be your backup? Because to me, it maybe isn't as much of the hesitancy to have Zeigler as your starting point guard as it is relying on maybe BJ Edwards being your backup. But I think people maybe are discounting Edwards a little bit because you've talked about him on this podcast before and you've liked a lot of what you've seen that you got to see Edwards, in person and stuff. So, I mean, maybe people are just kind of discounting Tennessee's young point guards, but I also understand the concern there because again, unless you don't really usually want to have a first and second year player as your point guard options. Last year was an exception because you had an outstanding freshman in Kennedy Chandler, but for the most part, you don't normally want young, sophomore freshmen to be your point guard options. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it because I can kind of see both sides in this argument, to be honest.
Right. So I think the biggest thing, like I've watched as you look at what they've done in recruiting is I don't think they're trying to recruit. I never thought they were really trying to recruit over Zeigler as much as they were trying to recruit maybe a change of pace to Zeigler. Like if you look, he and Chandler were similar but not alike. And like when you watch them play, there wasn't a ton of drop off when they were there, and so. But I also understand. I also remember you and I having these podcasts in January where, there were so many people that were frustrated with the state of affairs of the team, and a lot of that comes with handing the reins of your point guard position over to not just one freshman, but two true freshmen, not red shirts, none of that, like two freshmen. So it's good, in terms of recruiting, to go get another guy. Like, look, I understand they've got that. I'm the first to say I think that BJ Edwards is being undersold and underappreciated, undervalued in this recruiting class. But you want to make sure that you've got three guys prepared, and bringing another guard in now gives you the option to not necessarily have to play Vescovy, who's better not as a point guard at point. Like I think he did a little bit earlier in the year until Chandler and Zeigler just wrestled it away from him, which is I think what they wanted. And so so for me personally, I look at what Ziegler's done and I'm like, this guy's got a body of work to suggest that he could do it. Like I guess the only knock that I would have is the fact the kid is 5'9". And asking that kid to play 30-something minutes, potentially 25 to 30 minutes as the primary guard, because you have multiple guys who can obviously handle it and bring the ball up court, all this, that, the other. Edwards, Vescovy, Josiah. We'll see what the two new freshmen do. Edwards, obviously, not counting him, but the other two freshmen, Phillips and Jefferson. We'll see what they can do. Because Tennessee wants to play fast. So more people that can grab a rebound and just take off and go, that's what you want. But I just, I think that it looks to me like, I guess, you want to have that extra body in there. I don't think that you're recruiting over Zeigler. I think you're trying to complement him however you can. Like a lot of what they did last year was just two tough, hard-nosed freshmen, one from Memphis, one from New York, and just go in here and just battle. Not in a negative way, but just go battle and compete. Because that's what a lot of this stuff in sports is about now. It's like you're trying to bring in the top level of competition so you can just compete. And you can have guys who may not have the star ranking of other guys, see Zeigler, see Chandler. The star rankings don't matter as much as do you have two guys who are willing to go in there and fight for every minute they're going to get? And so, like, you got it. When you look at this year, if you can bring in another guy who has some experience, who can kind of um, push Ziegler to continue to be better, I see nothing wrong with that. Like, and so we'll see if they bring somebody else in, or if they just kind of kick it at this 12 with the open scholarship. It's obviously, we're at June. It's June 2nd now. I mean, they've been handing out that one scholarship, left and right. Kids just aren't taking it. So I don't think they necessarily want to hold it. Like, if you've got it, like, you'd probably much rather use it on a guard in this guard-driven era of basketball than go out and get another big, because you do have a few of those guys. You've got a 6'8" guy in Olivier. You've got obviously Euros. You've got obviously Jonas Adu. That's three guys with experience that you've got in that position. Then we'll see if Awaka, if he decides to come on board this year, which obviously there's a lot of reports that make that seem to be the case. That would give you four guys. So if you're going to use that last position, you've got wings all over the place. Tyreek Key, B.J. Edwards can probably slide over. We'll see what Meshack develops into. Vescovy, James, Phillips, Jefferson. You've got tons of those. So if you're going to use that last scholarship, use it on a guard. But I don't think it's necessarily we're going to find somebody better, because that kid was pretty good last year. So I don't know if you're going to find better, but you at least need to find somebody who can compete with him. And along with, obviously, with B.J. Edwards, too. Like, let those three battle it out for the minutes that are going to be allocated for next season.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the way I was leaning to. Is I guess I hadn't really put it into those words in my brain, but you were right. Like, the change of pace is more what I would want from point guard. I think you're right. I think it's been more kind of what the staff has been recruiting and looking for, is more of a change of pace type of guy. And I would love it to be Courtney Ramey. I'd love it to be anybody, because I agree with you. I just don't think you and I were talking about this before we started recording here. I just think the merit of holding on to a scholarship for the next year is gone now. Like, I don't think there's a reason to do that anymore with the way the transfer portal is. I think in years past, you look even 4 or 5 years ago, if Tennessee was in this situation, they missed out on, a lot of the point guard guys they've been going after, you maybe say, hey, maybe it's better just to hold on to the scholarships, the scholarship for next year, and try to get a guy in the recruiting, in recruiting next year, and just hold on to that spot, because you're better off, kind of waiting and seeing what you can get in, I guess in kind of the spring signing class, rather than, maybe even the fall, and then try to pull in a guy right now that, maybe isn't going to be as significant of a contributor this year. But honestly, with the way the transfer portal is now, I don't see the merit in holding on to keeping a spot open, because you're going to have spots come open, or you can even encourage spots to come open, like Tennessee's done. Like, a lot of the departures haven't been just guys wanting to leave because they wanted to leave themselves. There's been mutual parting of ways. There's been discussions of, hey, I think, I know this, I know one of my assistants, or, we have a guy over here, you can go over to. Like, there's been encouragement, and that's not a bad thing. It's also with looking out for the player, of their best interest, and saying, hey, you can get more playing time here. You're a good fit here. This will be somewhere you can thrive and shine. So it's not all like, underhanded. Oh, we don't, we need this spot open. How can we encourage these guys to leave and us not look like the bad guys? That's also hey, you deserve more playing time than what you're getting here. Go somewhere else. So I just don't think, I think they will find a way to fill that last scholarship spot in this 22 cycle. I don't know how they'll do it at this point. I don't have any info on Courtney Ramey. There's a team that people had mentioned before with him, and I've already forgotten who it was. For some reason, NC State's popping in my head, but it could be baseball related as opposed to basketball. I don't know. But I don't ultimately know where he ends up. Tennessee, there's guys that withdrew from draft consideration right now that, that just happens. Like, there's other point guards out there that were technically in the field of the draft that could be names to watch out for. There are other guys that you just mentioned as we're on the call here doing this recording, Gene. Malachi Smith had been a name out there for a long time. He finally just committed to Gonzaga. Like, that was a name that's been mentioned for a long time. A guy who's been, out of UTC for a while. Obviously, again, going through the draft process, was focused on that and maybe not as much in the transfer, but now today, June 2nd, made his decision. This month of June, we're in a recruiting era now where June, July, and August are still recruiting months for your upcoming season, not for the next cycle, but for your upcoming season, for your roster for the upcoming year. June, July, and August are still months you can use to find guys to add to your roster for the upcoming year. So Tennessee did last year, again, with not just Zakai Zeigler, but they added some guys like, I think it might have been around this time last year Tamba committed. I don't remember exactly when Tamba announced he was committing and reclassifying. Obviously he didn't play for Tennessee, but he still was added to the roster for last year, sometime in the late spring, early summer. I don't remember exactly when, but Tennessee's deluge of additions last year started in late April and went into May. So, I mean, it's not too far off from where it was last year too. So to me, I just think Tennessee is going to use that last spot. Just a matter of who and what and how, but I agree with you, Gene. I think it needs to be a guard because I think you're fine at post. You don't need as much post depth nowadays as you do guard depth. I think Tennessee's okay at post. You have a guy even in Julian Phillips who I think plays more of a 3, who can still have as a 4, but be a maybe Merk Barnes' offense be less of a traditional 4, more of a hybrid 4. We'll see just because of his skill set, but I still think he's more of a wing as you said too, and as we talked about last podcast. But again, you have guys returning like Camwa and Urosh and Adu, who I feel like as long as those guys are healthy, which is kind of a bit, I mean, that's a little bit of an if because Camwa, again, had the injury this past year. Adu was sick and injured, I think, earlier in the year last year, too. So maybe I just don't, I think with you bringing in Tobe Awaka as well, who I assume will reclassify to the 22 class, that's another body. That's a 4th option there who, again, you probably don't want to have to rely on him much this upcoming year, but he's a guy you have on the roster who, you didn't think after a certain point you were going to need Jonas Adu, and then you end up having to rely on him late in the year because of Camwa's injury. So you never know with injuries, but Gene, I agree with you. I think that last spot should go to a guard. I don't know who it's going to be or what, but I want to talk about, again, we had mentioned kind of the shiny new toy, and that being whoever Tennessee brings in at the last spot versus the returning products or returning product on the court, returning players to the team. We'd mentioned Vescovy and James coming back. That I don't think that can be, like, it was expected, but it's still, Gene, I don't think you can be, I always get the words confused, understated, overstated, whatever, enough about how important getting those two guys back for this upcoming season was. Again, it was expected that both would go to the draft process and come back, but sometimes, I mean, things don't always go as planned. So it was nice to see it, both of them, announced they're coming back to Tennessee. Vescovy, your leading 3-point shooter last year. James, your do-it-all guy, your leading rebounder, actually, which is also kind of surprising and cool that a 6'6" guy was your leading rebounder when you had a 6'8" and a 7-footer playing significant minutes for you last year. But Gene, you kind of look at the roster. I want to talk a little bit specifically about James here in a second. But you look at the roster, you obviously lose Kennedy Chandler, your top scorer, your leading assister, and one of your best 3-point shooters, and the guy who led you in steals. You're losing him, but then outside of that, you're returning 4 of your top 5 starters, your best 3-point shooter, your top rebounder, your guy who is second in assists in Vescovy, and actually third in assists in Zeigler, and your best 2 guys with steals per game behind Chandler. Chandler had 2.2 per game, and both Vescovy and Zeigler had 1.7. So you're still returning 4 of your 5 best players, essentially, from last year. And again, that's counting Camwa, who was hurt, but again, if he's healthy, I'm expecting him to take another step forward. But I want to talk about James, Gene, because you and I both are big Josiah-Jordan James fans. Anyone who's listened to this podcast knows that you and I are have been high on James for a while, and I think both of us felt very justified and happy that he started having the success he had at the end of the year. But that leads me into my question of, so looking at this upcoming season and kind of, looking at expectations of players, I think we know what we're going to get from Vescovy. He's a guy who can drop 13, 14, 15 a game, will shoot high 30s, low 40s from 3, like he did this past year. And just, as long as he can play off ball, that's what I fully expect from him consistently for the season. But James was a guy who started out, his first couple years had injury issues. I think it just was trying to find his game, trying to find what trying to mold himself a little bit into college. It also didn't have a great supporting cast when we first got to Tennessee. Then there's the COVID year, and then this past year started out slow from 3, especially. But again, his defense, rebounding have always been there. But then Gene, kind of down the stretch, in the last, really in conference play, but really the last month of this season, I'm going to look at kind of 2 different data sets here. Looking at his last 16 games of the season for him, including postseason play for him there. Looking at his last, I think 16 games, is that where I had it? Pull back from it, might have been. Let me see here. Yeah, his last 16 games of the season, starting from that Texas road game, where I think he was 3 of 7 from 3 in that game and had a double-digit scoring. But starting from that game, his last 16 games of the season, Gene, 13.7 points, shot 38.6% from 3, 6.2 rebounds, 2 assists, and a steal and a half per game, and about 32 minutes per game. If you narrow that down even further and look at what he did in the last 9 games of the season, which started at with the Auburn game at home, where Tennessee won that one, he had double digits in that one. You look at the last 9 games that he played, or excuse me, 8 games that he played, counting that one and then counting the SEC tournament, the NCAA tournament, he averaged 14.6 points per game, shot 44% from 3, 7.3 rebounds, almost 3 assists, and again, a steal and a half in 33 minutes per game. Gene, I don't expect James to be a guy who goes out and scores 14, 15 points a game next season and is still able to shoot 40% from 3, but I'm curious, what should we be expecting from him? Because it seems like he kind of gets off to slower starts. That just kind of maybe is his MO. You look at his first 3 years at Tennessee. I think if I compared his first half of the season, second half of the season, it seems like I think he just kind of gets better as the year goes on, as long as he's been able to avoid injury. But Gene, is what he did in that final month of the year, is that what we should be expecting from him? For this season in his 4th year, is that just consistently what we should be expecting from Josiah and moving forward? Or should we have, a little bit more tempered I'm just curious your thoughts, because again, we've talked about Josiah a lot on this podcast, and he's been a target of fan, I don't want to say vitriol, but he's been a target of fan discussion for a long time. And I think finally fans this past year, a lot of them turned the corner on him positively, because, hey, he was starting to produce, and hey, he was starting to kind of, do what maybe people were expecting him to do. That really that 3-point shooting was really stood out and took him to another level. Is that going to be the case this upcoming season, or was that a byproduct of the fact you had Kennedy Chandler as a point guard who, could drive to the lane and could shoot threes himself, and was kind of a product of the roster? Because I look at this upcoming season, Julian Phillips and Tyreek Key both are capable of driving to the bucket, drawing fouls, and being able to finish at the rim, which means they can drive the bucket and kick it back out to a guy like Josiah or Santi to shoot threes. But I would love to see, obviously love it, to see this type of production from Josiah when he comes back in for his 4th year. But I just don't know if that's fair to expect him to be a guy who averages 13, 14 points and then is still getting 6, 7 rebounds and is shooting 40-something% from 3, because those aren't easy numbers to sustain for 30-something games in a season.
So didn't he average like 7 rebounds a game the year before?
He's been pretty consistent with he's been in the high 5s, I want to say. Let me look at his overall stats. Yeah, his first year he averaged 5.5. His second year was 6.5, and this past year was 6. So he's been in that 5.5 to 6.5 rebound per game range all his entire career.
So I asked that question because the biggest change that I saw when I had a chance to watch Tennessee play was just the aggression that he played with, like in terms of just not passing up open looks. And I think that's going to be huge for him in terms of him taking that next step, is just being that person from day one. So when you I'm looking right now at these stats. It seems as though the biggest change that has existed has been it's in the shots. Like, I'm looking at a game here. I mean, people were pissed off about his 2 for 12, and it was against Texas Tech, a 5 of 11, and so you start seeing the shots go in, and it seems like in earlier years he wouldn't even take those shots. I think that was perhaps maybe the more frustrating thing, is that he would do a lot of the work, but he wouldn't take the shots. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So in the 2020-21 season, he only attempted 10 shots 4 times. In the 19-20 season, he only attempted 10 shots 4 times. Last year he did it certainly a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 times. And so once the averages start working themselves out, then you start to figure out, oh, okay, well, what is this kid? Because that's been the biggest change is that like the averages, if he maintains the averages while being aggressive, he's going to average more. He's going to score more. So I don't expect that to change because I think this aggression that he's played with, I think that's who he is now. I do. Now the open shots may look differently because at this point, as we talk on June 2nd, they've only got one really true creator. Maybe Edwards is the second person there from the roster that we're looking at now. But there's only one true creator because he got a lot of wide open threes. A lot of wide open threes. Mm-hmm. And will all of those same shots exist next season? I don't know. And if those shots aren't there, because he still has the size to go get those shots, to get the mid-range shots. Not everything has to be a wide open three. Like there's always this narrative that like the game of basketball has changed to just jacking up a ton of threes, 40, 45 threes a game. Like some of the best teams at the highest level of basketball are looking for best shots. Now, I mean, like you watch the Golden State Warriors, they have two of the greatest shooters to ever grace the planet, but they're not always just out there shooting threes. They're just very special at it. And so like there is a value in taking mid-range threes, and Josiah is very good at getting to his spots and taking those shots. I think Vescovi's good at that too, but as it pertains to Josiah, I see no reason to think that there would not be more of what we've seen in the past. Because more of what we saw last year. Because I mean, like that player doesn't just leave, if that makes any sense. Like that player isn't just going to go away now. Like that mindset's not going to go away. Now it may be difficult early in the season to figure out his spots because again the roster doesn't look the same. Fulkerson had a special spot in that rotation on that team. Like even a guy whose impact was largely minimal in Huntley Hatfield. That I think Olivier occupies some of that same space, so I don't think there's going to be much of a change there. But I mean, also his the emergence of Josiah also kind of coincided some with Olivier being on too. So how does that work now? And so like I don't think that changes. I mean, I think this is a kid who is whatever it takes for the team type player, which is an admirable player, but does this team need him to be that same aggressive person? I think they do. And if he doesn't believe that they need it, how long will it take for Barnes and that staff to get him to understand, no, we need that guy that we saw in January and February and March last season. We need that guy. That guy led us to a championship. That guy got us a championship in the tournament. That's who we need. We don't need you to revert back to one of those first 2 years. And so I think there's going to be more shooting because obviously what people like the work that kid put in terms of his 3-point shot last offseason is admirable. I think we're going to see an even more improved shot because now he's gotten some NBA feedback. So they're telling him what he needs to work on. So whatever he needs to work on, which is probably that shot, being more consistent, being more aggressive, you're going to see more of that. Because if NBA is his goal, he can't start slow. Especially if they're, because I feel like the knock on the kid is that he sometimes is not aggressive consistently. So you can't in turn start the season off lacking aggression. Because that just feeds into what they're saying about you. So I think you may see an aggressive kid from day one, and that can only benefit Tennessee, especially as they're going to have to try to figure out this point guard position regardless of who else comes in or if nobody else comes in. They're going to have to figure out how these minutes are going to get allocated because some stuff. Vescovi, Josiah, Adu's a good player. Some of that stuff. But there's still some questions there, too, in terms of how these minutes are going to get out there between Zeigler and Key and Edwards and maybe a new kid. So you're going to need the guys like Vescovi and Josiah to really be leaders and be aggressive while the other pieces are trying to sort themselves out.
Yeah, I think aggression, that's a word that you said multiple times. And I think that's a key for me this upcoming season because I know from talking with Tyreek Key here on the show, and I know from talking with Julian Phillips, head coach at Link Academy, that both of those guys, they didn't lack for aggression. Phillips as a high school player, Key as his entire career at Indiana State. Like those guys were not afraid to attack the basket. Key again showed in college that he could do it. He averaged 5-6 free throw attempts per game. He's a guy that was a 6'3" bowling ball, more or less out there that, he said himself that he likes drawing out contact. He likes seeking contact. And that mindset kind of reminds me of, a few years ago with the Admiral Schofields and the Grant Williams and those guys that, more Grant that, was not afraid of contact, would not shy away. Phillips is 6'3", or not Phillips, excuse me, Key's 6'3". He's not going to be a guy getting down the post like Grant was and doing spin moves and all that stuff, but he's a guy that can drive to the basket and isn't afraid of contact. Phillips is talented enough to go drive to the basket and use spin moves and different stuff to go out. He's obviously built very differently than Grant was and is, but both those guys, I fully expect Gene to be more aggressive than what Tennessee had this past year, because I think that was a good point. Like James still didn't attack the basket like how I would love to have seen him do on a consistent basis, but he did it more as the year went on. As you said, like that's reflected too in his field goal attempts, because not all of those were from three. He did have a lot of games where he shot 5, 6, 7 3-point attempts, but he had more games too where he finally, after the first half of the year, stopped settling for threes and went more mid-range, and then also did do things around the basket. But aside from him and Kennedy Chandler, Tennessee didn't have and Zeigler would try, but it's harder to do it when you're 5'9", and that was also reflected in his 2-point shooting. Field goal percentage was not super high, but Tennessee didn't have a whole lot of really aggressive players that were able to go and finish at the rim last year. This year, I think you're going to have more, and I think you made a really good point about James. I think if he continues to still be that aggressive that we saw him in the last month of the year, then yeah, those numbers are sustainable, and with the number of shots he can keep putting up. But again, how many of those shots are going to be there? Because like you said, I think a lot of that coincided too with Olivier going down. Now you're going to have Phillips taking away shots. You're going to have Key taking away shots. Camwau's back, and he's going to be taking away shots. You're going to have Vescovi, you better be getting Vescovi for the most part, at least 10 attempts per game. He averaged 10 last year, and Chandler averaged 11.5. But you better be getting Vescovi his looks because he's your best scorer. Like there's no other question about it. He's Tennessee's best scorer. He's been Tennessee's best scorer the last couple of years for the most part. But finally this past year really got to be more off ball and do it. Obviously Kennedy Chandler led the team in scoring, but most of the season Vescovi was the one leading the team in scoring. It wasn't until Chandler kind of really came on strong in the last few weeks of the season that he overtook him. It wasn't by a whole lot. 13.9 points per game for Chandler, 13.3 for Vescovi. But I think James has been and will be the X factor for Tennessee. He was the X factor kind of last year. You looked at when he had his more successful games, Tennessee tended to have success themselves. This year, I think it's going to be the same thing. I think if James can be the aggressive guy and he's always been a great glue guy. He's always been a great do-it-all player. But really, it's like you said, the aggression that we saw from him the last month that really kind of changed things for him and took his game to another level. And the confidence. He was a guy that would shoot threes and looked like they were going to go in. Every single time he shot it, you thought that three is going in, which was never a thought I had about him in his first 2.5 years at Tennessee. Not that he was a horrible 3-point shooter his first couple years, but it wasn't amazing. You look at his first year, he was good. He was 36.5% from three. And in fact, in conference play that year, he shot 42.6% from three in the regular season. But then you look at his second year, only basically 31% from three. Again, COVID year. This past year, if you look at just the base number, 32.4, doesn't look amazing. But then you look at the conference play where he shot 33%. Then you look at the SEC tournament and the NCAA tournament. Again, the last month of the year where he shot 44% from three. then you start to say, okay, he came on strong after a really slow start. Kind of like Grant Williams in the NBA. Had a slow start, was 0 of 25 from 3 in his first year at his first 25 three-point attempts. And now look at him. He's a consistent 40% three-point shooter at the NBA level. But yeah, I think the aggressiveness really, like you said, I think that took Josiah's game to the next level. Does he continue to do that this year? And if he does, then I agree with you. I don't know that there's going to be too much of a drop off from maybe what you got from him down the stretch. It'll be interesting. We've already alluded to it multiple times on this podcast. The minute allocation for next year is going to be really interesting. It'll work itself out in practices and games and stuff, but it's just there's a lot of interesting combos you could look at for the roster and the lineups for next year for Tennessee on paper. Again, we'll see once we get to practices how, you know, a guy like Tyreek Key comes back from his surgery, how he meshes at a Power 5 level. Because again, he played at Indiana State, which was not in a bad conference, but it's a difference playing, you know, really high major programs 3 or 4 times a year. It's all of a sudden you're playing 18 games plus in a season against high major programs. Because Tennessee doesn't just play, you know, 18 SEC games and a bunch of rest of them are scrubs. We just, as of Wednesday night, Gene, I think Jeff Goodman tweeted out that Tennessee's in the Barclays, and their team they're facing is Maryland. You've also always, it seems like Tennessee and Gonzaga always play, Tennessee, Kansas always play. You had the Big 12 SEC Challenge. I've already forgotten some of the teams Tennessee, or some of the early season tournaments Tennessee's matched up with this year. But, you know, it's not just 18 games, it's 22, 23, 24 games against high major opponents that you are going to be playing this season upcoming, excuse me. So how does Key adjust to that? Julian Phillips, the transition from high school to college. You know, there's a lot of different things that, you know, it may look good on paper, but just because it looks good on paper doesn't always mean it translates into reality. Because look at Brandon Huntley Hatfield. He looked good on paper. Didn't translate as well in reality. Again, maybe it translates better for him at Louisville. We'll see. But Gene, kind of the last thing here before we get going. First of all, I want to say congratulations to Grant Williams and the Celtics. My Celtics, Gene, for getting to the NBA Finals. Grant didn't have quite as a eye-catching performance in Game 7 against the Heat like he did against Game 7 against the Bucks, but he still went out there and looked pretty solid in Game 7. And he seems like he steps up in Game 7s. He's had 2 really good Game 7s for Boston, and he really helped them. He wasn't the main reason they won that game against the Heat, but he did help them. He had some key moments there, some key shots and some key defensive plays as well that really helped spur Boston on to the finals. So pretty cool to see Grant Williams go play in the NBA Finals. The only one I can remember in recent memory of a Tennessee player winning an NBA title was Jordan McRae with the Cavs, and I don't think he played any minutes in that finals. I think he just was on the roster, but I mean, he has a ring, so heck, he can show people his NBA championship ring, but he won one. But in terms of guys that actually like played in it and had a role in an NBA Finals, I'm struggling to think of one. Gene, am I just forgetting someone? Because I know Bernard King didn't get one, Allen Houston didn't get one, unless it was a case of another Jordan McRae that was just kind of on the roster. I can't think of someone who actually had a role and like played minutes in every game of the finals that were on a finals team that was a Vol, because there just hasn't been that many Vols that have been on really good teams in the NBA, unfortunately. Unless I'm forgetting somebody and you happen to know of, which I don't know if you would, but before you get into other stuff, I just want to throw that to you because I can't think of one besides McRae in the last 20, 30 years that was on a NBA Finals roster.
I can't.
Yeah,
I can't really. Yeah, it's like I'm trying to remember. The last one was Allen Houston in 1999.
Oh, was he on a wow?
Yeah, that Knicks team that was an 8 seed. He was like a starter.
Oh, right.
Like, yeah. He was like that was the team that I think got beat by the Spurs. It's interesting. Quick side note to completely to close the Josiah loop. Weird stat: the kid has taken more threes than twos in his career, and in 2 of his 3 years in Knoxville. That's just his last 2 seasons included, which is just kind of just jarring to me. Um, but anyways, yeah, I mean, it's just not. Maybe this speaks towards. Maybe you hope this is good towards the future, but like the trying to not get yelled at by Tennessee Twitter. They're not like the guys that are going to the pros aren't exactly pro guys. Like they may have some pro characteristics, but if you look like Jordan Bone, like Admiral Schofield, like even Grant was too good to fail. It's because obviously he developed a part of his game. If Grant had developed a three and he was the same player he was in Tennessee, he would not be in the league right now. Yes. That's a fact. Mm-hmm. It's a fact. That's just truth. I think he's kind of spoke some to that too. Like keep going. The two kids, Johnson and Springer, they're yeah. I understand they have like the star ranking coming out of high school, but like they're not NBA ready guys immediately. They may get there. I mean, and obviously you certainly think they can. I mean, heck, look no further than the team that the Celtics are playing tonight with Jordan Poole, who was a G League guy. I think Kuminga plays, and he bounced back and forth. Their other Moses Moody from Arkansas bounced back and forth. Like those are three guys who have actually done stuff. All G League guys, so it's possible. But like I don't know. We'll see what happens with Chandler. With I haven't even looked at NBA draft projections and stuff like that. I don't know. Just my assumption is that he's probably anywhere between 20 and 40. That would just be a guess, and that's based off of nothing. Yeah, and probably more closer to like 20 to 35. 25 to 35, I'd say, because of his size. But so, I mean, to see where Grant is now, like that's very telling. I mean, and the other side of that is, like this is what fans wanted, man. Like you want to feel relevant. Grant makes you relevant. Now you got to build on that, because even like Kentucky has bad teams recently. Obviously, this past season was a good season, but the year before was bad. But 2 years before that, I mean, you look at the NBA Finals in the bubble. Like Bam Adebayo and Tyler Hero were out there making plays. Like that's where you want to get. You've got one of those guys right now. Is there a second one coming, or is Tennessee? Are they just getting really good players who will develop and figure some stuff out and be good? Because look, man, I'll always say I look at some of Josiah's metrics and compare him with Draymond Green now in the league. He may not be, and this is no knock on Josiah, but he's not the defender in terms of like just being a quarterback that Draymond is. Better perimeter defender, not as good post. But just like, could that be the next guy? Because Draymond was like a 4-year guy. Mm-hmm. Josiah can be that too. And it sounds stupid, and obviously we make all the comparisons. Like, just looking at numbers, I was making the Jalen Brunson comparison a couple of years ago simply based off numbers and nothing else. But guess what? Josiah is not that. Josiah is not a bull in a china shop.
No.
But he's a really good player. And I think at the next level, he could be one of those guys because he has the size. He could do some of those Draymond things that obviously doesn't look the same. He can shoot better than Ben Simmons. He can play, kind of that sort of style. Like maybe he's your next sort of guy to where, and I think Grant is, what Grant's doing, I think is going to be great for a guy like Josiah. Because he's showing, as everybody gets enamored with like the 18-year-old kids who, go to the league and flame out 2 years later because they were never ready. Now, I understand the G League's is better for these kids now, and it exists for these kids now. But Grant comes in, spends 3 years in college. He's young when he gets to college. He grows for 3 years. He develops. He goes to the league, and really kind of develops his game in the pros. And like Draymond's another example of that multi-year guy. So I think you're going to start seeing NBA teams start taking more chances on kids who aren't 17, 18 years old, because these are investments. And these owners, they love their money. I'm not going to invest on a kid who I may never see. There may never be an ROI there. I'm going to need to see some of that money coming back. And so a kid like Josiah gives you a chance to do that. And so that's why I think somebody's success like Grant could be really beneficial for a kid like that, like Josiah, who is still developing as a player, who we still may not have seen his best. Let's be clear.
Mm-hmm.
Like unfortunately, he's got some admirable tendencies in terms of his shot selection, because he's got the size and build to be a lot more aggressive in getting to the basket, but they never seem to. They prefer to shoot fadeaways and mid-range jump shots, and that's fine. But like there's also truth there, like whether we like it or not. Like there's just a level of truth there. But I mean, like you're looking at a kid who has all the metrics and he has the athleticism, more athletic than Admiral. Probably a better ball handler than Admiral. And look, last time I checked, the Admiral's still getting NBA paychecks.
Mm-hmm.
They may say G League, they may say Orlando Magic. They name whatever the horrible NBA franchise is. OKC, I'm looking at you. Washington Wizards a couple of years ago, where he got drafted. Orlando Magic, whoever they are. Houston Rockets will probably be next on this list. But look, I'm saying to be honest, like, look, like he's still collecting NBA paychecks, and we can laugh, but like he wins there, because all he needs is kind of like AAU basketball. All he's going to need is like one good sequence of games where he ends up on waivers or something like that and gets picked up by a team who's like average to above average. He does something there. All of a sudden he's back in the league full time. But look, I think Josiah is better than that. And so I think as we go forward, and obviously, good luck to your team tonight, because I actually think they're the better team. I just also think that there's an experience factor that may favor the Warriors in the series. Every time, look, man, number 12 is going to be open. Uh-huh. We know that much. Like, I mean, I don't think he's going to be open 18 times like he was in that game 7, for a guy who shot over 40% from 3. But he's going to be open. And if he can make some shots, he may end up having a game where he ends up being the hero, especially as he has to play more with, I think, Robert Williams always being in and out of the lineup.
Those are good points. Again, I mean, we just focus on Josiah again, but this is another Josiah podcast. Maybe we should just rename the show. But no, you made very good points, Gene. I agree with a lot of the points you made too. But really quickly, to close out this episode, I wanted to touch on the 2023 prospect who committed to Tennessee. Again, this is a 23 cycle. He's a whole year away before he even gets on campus, assuming he sticks with his commitment, which most basketball players do. It's a lot rarer to see. More rare? I don't know. To see basketball players decommit and flip their commitments like you see in basketball, or in football, excuse me. But Cade Phillips, the 4-star forward in the 23 class, committed to Tennessee, played down in Jacksonville, Alabama. Gene, already seen some comparisons to a John Fulkerson from him, just because he's a 6'9" white boy, but I think and Fulkerson was athletic. I just think he's a different player than Fulkerson. People are just seeing the white kid who's 6'9" and saying, "Oh, he's going to be the next Fulkerson." I made that joke to a couple of my friends too, but I don't think he's going to be John Fulkerson. I think he's a different player. But I also think it's interesting, Gene, that it's not just any 4-star forward that Tennessee picked up, and not even any 4-star forward from Alabama that Tennessee could pick up. He is about as Alabama legacy as you could get, and he's not going to the Crimson Tide. I think they offered him. I just think I have seen people say he wasn't a take. I don't think it was that he wasn't a take. I just don't think that he had the interest in Alabama, so they stopped recruiting him, because they didn't want to keep barking up that tree when they weren't going to get any results from it. You go back to his grandfather, John Croyle, was a All-American defensive lineman for Alabama. His mother, Reagan Croyle Phillips, was a basketball player for Alabama. His dad, John David Phillips, played quarterback for Alabama. His uncle, well, you'll probably remember this name, Brody Coyle, played for Alabama and, of course, played in the NFL as well. So he had his grandfather, his mom and dad, and his uncle all not just attended Alabama, but also played sports at Alabama. And he didn't choose the Tide. He did not choose the Tide. He chose Tennessee, who I know Tennessee and Alabama aren't as big of rivals in basketball, but three of those relatives played football. Tennessee and Alabama are, huge rivals in football. Gene, I think I've watched some of his highlights and stuff. Again, he's a 23 prospect. I don't think we'll probably spend a whole lot of time talking about what he can bring to the table because, again, he's a 23 kid who, let's be frank, he's not a 5-star. He's not a guy that he got attention for sure, but he got attention not just because he's a 4-star forward, but also because of, again, the lineage he had, and he didn't choose Alabama. Like this would be, I guess maybe you can compare it to back a few years ago when in football for Tennessee, when a Cade Mays, for example, didn't just decommit from Tennessee, he went to a rival in Georgia. Like this is kind of that same level of, Cade had family, the multiple generations of family who attended and played at Tennessee. This is similar to where Cade Phillips, again, another Cade, I guess. It's funny that two Cades there that popped in my head. But Cade Phillips, again, I don't know, you could be more inundated with Alabama than what Cade Phillips probably had been growing up. And he chooses Tennessee. Like that's just, it's a very interesting storyline. As long as he sticks with his commitment and comes to Tennessee, I think he will play. I think he'll end up, maybe not as a freshman as much, but I think he will be a guy that plays. It'll be really interesting to see when Tennessee takes on Alabama with Cade Phillips in the roster. And his mom and dad out there, probably decked out in orange, or at least sitting there in the crowd with the Tennessee fans. Gene, like that's such a really interesting experience. I'm looking forward to the Mike Wilson article about it in a couple years.
Yeah, I don't know anything about the whole take industry. It does seem like Tennessee's style is probably a little more conducive than what Alabama likes to do. I don't really care. I do find it interesting. I was in Tuscaloosa about 2-3 weeks ago for a softball game, and I was talking to a guy who said something about, I mentioned to him that I once covered Tennessee basketball, and he was like, "Man, I think they're about to get one of our guys." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's what I've heard too." And he was like, "Man, I hope he's gonna make his decision next week. I hope we get him." And I'm thinking to myself, y'all don't really even stand a chance from what I've gathered. But I guess until the last minute, like they were still thinking that like there was a shot. And like, I mean, obviously it's not everybody, monitors recruiting and things of that nature. They just hear, legacy kid from Alabama is going to go to Alabama. But yeah, man, kid has potential to be a really nice player, really nice piece. You watch some of his game, like, he's kind of aggressive. I mean, he's trying to, I think he has a skill to his game. It's not like everything is, dunk, 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 dunk. But I do think that you're talking about a guy who has the potential of coming in and maybe contributing in his career. I don't really necessarily have a proper comparison for him. I understand it's really easy to go the Fulkerson route for. I don't know why you would go the Fulkerson route unless there's just one thing that seems to stand out about both him and John Fulkerson, which apparently there obviously is one thing that stands out about the two of them. But like, I don't know, man. Like maybe there's some more. Like maybe there's some Olivier there in what he does. I mean, like it's not overly polished. It's good. But like I said, it's not polished necessarily. Like, I don't know where that fits. I don't know how he fits. But anytime you can bring in a 6'9" kid who's a good basketball player, it certainly holds well for your future. And I mean, Tennessee, I don't think they're losing any bigs, right? You always expect to lose one or something, but is Urosh finally gone? Or
no? From a graduation perspective, both the VA and Urosh I believe
juniors
can return for the 23-24 season.
One of those guys will transfer. But yeah, I mean, like you're always trying to replenish the roster. And look, if you obviously couldn't necessarily find a big that you were enamored with from the portal this signing class. So go ahead and bring one in that could maybe you could develop, next season. And if you do have two seniors in Eurosh and Olivier there, and then you've got what would be a junior in Tamba. I'm sorry, not Tamba. Where did Tamba come from? Jonas. Then yeah, that's definitely not. Then like that helps you stagger that position in recruiting, which I think is really good because that kid can maybe come in redshirt for a year and learn, battle and practice, and then in the 24-25 season, he's ready to contribute.
No, good points. Again, well, I'm sure I'll talk about him more in the future. But again, 23 kid who I committed probably around the same time BJ Edwards committed last year, because Edwards we talked about him committing as a 22 prospect, I believe in the summer of last year. So again, he stayed committed to Tennessee for almost the whole year before, coming on, or I guess a year early, whatever. But yeah, Cade Phillips getting the 23 class started off right for Tennessee. I guess technically Tobe Awaka got the 23 class started off for Tennessee, but again, fully expecting him to reclassify into the 22 class. But that'll be where we're in the podcast show, wherever you want to call it here. Again, it's great talking with you, Gene. I know it's been a couple weeks, so it's great having you back on here with me to talk some hoops and talk about Tennessee basketball. We'll hopefully do it again next week, and maybe even have a mailbag episode. I think there may be still a couple of things we could talk about before we go out for a mailbag one for asking you guys for what you want us to talk about. But we maybe still do anyway, because I like hearing what you guys want us to talk about and hearing your questions and answering them on the show. So maybe we'll do a mailbag one next week. If you want to go ahead and send us some, you can if you want to, but it'd be fantastic. If you guys want to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast and leave us a 5-star review on Spotify, that'd be fantastic as well. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already, and like this video. Again, share it around and let Vol fans or basketball fans in general know about it, because we have plenty of awesome stuff coming for you this summer and for this upcoming season as well. Signing off for Gene, I am Nathanael. This has been another episode of the Vol Basketball Fever Podcast. Thank you for watching Vol Basketball Fever. Give this video a like and subscribe to the channel while you're here. We appreciate all your support, and the show wouldn't be possible without Vol fans like you. Thank you.